All right, let's dive into some pretty cool tools this time. We're talking measurement tools, specifically the tape measure and the architect scale.
Ah, the classics.
Right. We got a bunch of stuff on these diagrams, explanations, even you sent over a YouTube tutorial.
Yeah, that one's pretty hands-on. Should be good for everyone.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And the whole point of this deep dive is to make sure that you can not just understand a scale drawing, but actually be able to create one yourself.
It's kind of amazing how these tools can like bridge that gap,
Huh.
between a real thing you can touch and then how it ends up on a drawing.
Yeah,
It's like a secret language.
totally. And that's what I think is so cool about this. It's something you can actually use in everyday life. You could be doing a DIY project, working with a contractor, even if you just want to get a better picture in your head of a space.
Absolutely.
This stuff is super helpful.
And once you know how to use them, they can be really empowering. I mean, in so many situations.
So let's break it down a bit. First things first, right? We need to know what each tool is even for.
Okay, so at its core, a tape measure, it's all about getting those real world dimensions. Inches, feet, all that concrete stuff, how big something is.
Makes sense. And then the architect scale, that comes in when we want to translate those measurements onto a drawing, right?
Exactly. That way you can represent something huge, like a whole building on just a little piece of paper.
Right.
And it keeps everything in proportion. It's like shrinking down reality, but without losing any of the important details.
Okay, starting to see the connection here, yeah. But before we get too deep into the how, I think it's good to talk about the why.
The why always matters.
It does. Like, why is it so important that we're accurate when we're using these tools,
Yeah.
especially when we're talking about making scale drawings?
Oh, that's a huge point. Because even a little mistake, like in a measurement or how you scale something, it can have a domino effect,
Yeah.
leading to big problems in the end product. Like just imagine trying to build a bookshelf, but you used a drawing with the wrong measurements.
Oh.
You could end up with shelves that don't fit, or the whole thing could be wobbly.
Yikes. Okay, I see where you're going with this. Kind of like measure twice, cut once, but with like way higher stakes.
Exactly. And when you're talking about scaled drawings, especially for things like architecture or construction, those measurements aren't just numbers on paper.
Right.
They're like instructions for building something real.
No pressure.
No pressure, but accuracy is key.
Okay, so let's zoom in on each tool. Let's start with the tape measure. One of the things you sent over has a close-up picture of all the markings on it.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to say, it can look pretty confusing if you're not used to it. Kind of like a jumbled mess of lines and numbers.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming at first, but it's actually pretty logical once you understand the main parts of it.
Okay, good, because I remember the first time I tried to figure out all those tiny little marks.
I
I was totally lost. So, what should people be looking for when they're trying to read a tape measure?
Okay. The most important thing to remember is that a tape measure is usually marked in feet, inches, and then fractions of an inch. You'll see the biggest marks for the whole inches, and then they get smaller and smaller for the halves, quarters, eighths, and even sixteenths.
Wait, sixteenths?
Whoa! Yeah, absolutely. Because think about it. If you need to be super precise, down to the tiniest detail, those little 16th inch markings can be like lifesavers,
Hmm.
especially if you're working with wood or
Hmm.
anything else where you can't be even a tiny bit off.
Wow, never realized there was so much detail packed into one little tool.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about that hook on the end? I've always wondered about that. Like, what's it actually for besides just hooking onto things?
Well, that hook, it's actually way more clever than you might think. It's designed to move a little bit, and that movement is actually on purpose.
Wait, really? I always thought it was just like fixed in place. So why would it need to move?
It all comes down to accuracy, whether you're measuring the outside of something or the inside. See, when you measure an outside dimension, the hook slides out a tiny bit, and that adds its thickness to the measurement. But when you measure something on the inside, it slides in, so it subtracts its thickness to give you the actual measurement between the two surfaces.
That is so smart. I've been using a tape measure for years, and I never knew that.
It's one of those things that seems so simple once you know about it,
No, totally.
but it makes a huge difference in how accurate you are.
So, okay, now we know a bit more about the tape measure and how to use it right. But let's move on to the architect scale. This is where things start getting really interesting for me, because now we're talking about taking those real-world measurements and turning them into something visual.
You got it. And the architect's scale is the tool that makes all that possible. Yeah, it's like you said, it shrinks those buildings down so they fit on a piece of paper.
Exactly. But like with anything new, there's a bit of a learning curve here, right? Like, first of all, what's with this triangular ruler? Why has it got to have all these different edges and numbers all over it?
Ah, the architect scale. Well, it's all about options, really. See, each edge has different scales on it, so you can, translate those real-world measurements onto drawings at different ratios.
Okay, so that's the edges. But what about all those numbers? I see fractions like 18, 14, 12. What do those even mean?
Those tell you the different scales you can use for your drawings. It's kind of like zoom levels on a camera, you know?
Oh, okay.
A smaller fraction like that 18 that gives you a closer view with more detail, and then a bigger fraction like 12. That's for a wider view.
So if I'm drawing something small and detailed, like a chair or something, I might use the 18 sec scale. But for a whole floor plan of a house, I'd probably use the 12.
You got it. Choosing the right scale, it all depends on how big the thing you're drawing is and how much detail you need to show.
Makes sense. This is starting to make more sense now. But one thing I've always been confused about is this whole idea of drawn to scale. What does that actually mean?
Drawn to scale just means that the drawing represents the real thing with the right proportions. So, for example, let's say we're using the 14 Aluris 1 scale.
Okay.
That means every quarter inch on the drawing is equal to 1 foot in real life.
So if I measure a line on a drawing and it's, say, 2 inches long, and we're using that 14 Eller to Larn scale, that would really be an 8-foot wall in the actual house.
That's it. That's exactly how it works. And that's the cool thing about scaled drawings. They let us visualize and work with these big things, but in a way that we can actually manage.
All right, I'm following you. But there's one more thing that's always tripped me up. I've heard that some scales are red, like left to right, and others are right to left. How do you even know which way to go?
That's a good question, and it definitely trips people up. But luckily, there's a good tip in that YouTube video you sent. They point out that the 18-10 scale, you usually read that right to left, but the 34 scale, you go left to right.
Ah, okay, that makes it easier. So it's not just about picking the right scale, it's about knowing how to read it the right way too.
You got it. Once you master that, you'll be like flying through scaled drawings. No problem.
Speaking of that video, remember how the instructor broke down those inch increments on the 300 scale?
Oh, yeah.
I was amazed. Like, each little mark on that scale, it's actually 18 of an inch.
It is. And it just shows how different scales are good for different things. That 3/10 scale, you'd probably use that for a super detailed view where you need to show really precise measurements, like for framing, insulation, stuff like that.
So it's like zooming in on a specific part of the drawing to get like the smallest details, right?
Exactly. Think of it like switching from a wide-angle lens to a macro lens on a camera. They both show you the same thing, but in different ways.
Wow, this is really clicking for me now.
Hmm.
It's amazing how much information and how precise these tools can be, and they seem so simple at first glance.
It is pretty amazing. And once you know how to use them, you can really unlock a whole new level of understanding and even control over whatever you're building, like designing a house, a piece of furniture, anything.
Right, right. Okay, feeling pretty good about all this. But one thing that still kind of scares me is like actually using these tools in a real project. Like, let's say I'm doing a kitchen renovation. Where do I even start?
Oh, perfect example. And that's a great way to see how the tape measure and the architect's scale, how they work together.
Okay.
So first things first, grab your tape measure and go get all those real world measurements.
So I'm measuring everything. Walls, windows, doors, like the whole shebang.
Yep. The whole 9 yards. You want the width and length of the room, the ceiling height, where the doors and windows are, anything that's already there that'll affect your design.
And I'm guessing accuracy is like super important here.
Super important. Remember, these measurements, they're the foundation of your whole project. A little mistake here could turn into a big headache later. So double check everything.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to use those 16th inch markings on your tape measure if you need to.
Got it. Measure twice, cut once. But okay, I've got all my measurements. Now what? How do I like turn them into a plan I can actually use? That's where the architect scale comes in, right?
Right. Now you're going to translate those real world measurements onto a drawing, like a floor plan. Choose the right scale. For a kitchen, 14, that's a good one to start with. And then use your architect scale to get those dimensions on the paper accurately.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm getting this, let's say I measured a wall and it's 12 feet long. If I'm using that 14 feet on one scale, I'd draw a line on my floor plan that's 3 inches long to show that wall.
Right. Exactly. You're basically shrinking that 12-foot wall down so it fits on your paper, but you're keeping all the proportions right.
This is so cool. So I can do that for all the measurements and end up with like a mini version of my whole kitchen on one piece of paper?
That's it. And that's where the real magic happens. Now you can play around with different layouts, see how different appliances would fit, even like get a feel for how the whole space will work.
It's like having a virtual model of my kitchen before I even start doing any real work.
Exactly. And remember, this works for anything, not just kitchens. You can use these tools for any project where you need accurate measurements and you want to be able to see it all laid out, like designing a garden, building a shelf, anything like that.
My mind is like buzzing with ideas now.
Yeah.
This has been so helpful, honestly. I feel like I have a whole new set of skills for tackling projects around the house.
That's awesome. And remember, the more you practice, the better you'll get. It's all about getting comfortable with the tools.
So true. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with me. I learned so much today.
My pleasure. Happy measuring.